It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you in June of 2024 from Atlanta in the Muskogee Creek Territory in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountain Range. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics these days, the rather new field of road ecology that examines how our vast systems of roads and all our car and truck traffic is dissecting landscapes and making life dangerous and often lethal for other animal species, and what we can do about it to support biodiversity and to share our planet more equitably with these other animals. Our guest is award-winning environmental journalist and writer Ben Goldfarb, author of the 2023 book Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. Let me tell you a bit about Ben Goldfarb. He is an independent conservation journalist who resides in Colorado. His previous book, Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, won the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And Ben's reporting has also appeared in major publications such as The Atlantic, New York Times, Washington Post, Science, National Geographic, Outside Magazine, Vice News, Guardian, so many places. His website is bengoldfarb.com. And we're going to be discussing his book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. I found it so eye-opening and so comprehensive. It's about every aspect of road and vehicle impacts you could ever think of for all kinds of animals, from bears to butterflies to frogs and fish. And so many interesting and well-written stories about humans and individuals of other species. It's heartbreaking to hear about this constant mass killing of animals and infringement upon their freedoms, migration, and lives. But it's also heartwarming due to all the people, from engineers and biologists to animal activists, trying to help other animals and find solutions like building wildlife crossings and rewilding older forest roads. In terms of accolades for his book, Crossings was named one of the best books of 2023 by outlets including the New York Times, the New Yorker, Smithsonian, Science News, and Kirkus Reviews. It was also named by Booklist as a top 10 book on the environment and sustainability for 2024. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And I'm glad you found the book to be a combination of heartbreaking and heartwarming. That's
Yes.
exactly the line
You,
I was trying to walk.
yeah, you did that by like bringing in the caretakers, and just
Mhm.
showing the passion of so many people who would work in a particular space on particular animals to get something accomplished. And so that I really, and I'm expecting your book to win more awards, like as the awards roll out for this year. I think it's really fantastic.
I hope you're right.
Well, what took you from your investigation of beavers to your investigation of roads and how they affect other animals? I know you've been working on this wildlife crossings book for many years, right?
Yeah, it really dates back to 2013. I was in Montana writing about habitat fragmentation and connectivity, this idea that animals need to roam large landscapes, right? And in places like Montana, there are grizzly bears and elk and wolverines, all of these big, wide-ranging creatures that have to move long distances to find habitat and shelter and mates and food and all the things that, all organisms need, right? And of course, roads get in their way, unfortunately. And so while I was in Montana back in 2013, I had the chance to take a tour of these wildlife crossings, these overpasses and underpasses and culverts and tunnels, all of these different structures that humans had built across Highway 93 north of Missoula. And there's a kind of a fascinating story there. Basically, that highway passes through native land, through the reservation of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And the tribes basically said to the state of Montana in the early 2000s, look, your highway is slaughtering all of these animals that are so integral to our culture. And you really have to build these wildlife passages to allow these animals to move safely back and forth across the highway. And so, really at the tribe's behest,
Yeah.
the state and federal government did that, and they built around 40 of these wildlife crossings. And so I had the chance to get up on top of one of these wildlife overpasses, one of these bridges that had been constructed for elk and moose and bears and other critters. And it was just so beautiful and inspiring. We do so much on this planet, as your listeners know, to make wild animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And here was this, incredible piece of infrastructure that we'd built to make their lives a little bit easier and safer. And so I just found that to be a kind of a wonderful idea. And that got me excited about this broader topic of road ecology and how roads change nature and what we can do to make our infrastructure lie a little lighter on the land.
That's awesome. I've been able to see that particular wildlife overpass too in
Yeah.
Montana, but I just pulled over to the side of the road and kind of took a picture. But so I liked reading in your book how you got to go up on it and see a little bit more about it. But yeah, that was a real victory. Thanks to the Native American tribe there. Now, roads for our vehicles seem so normal and benign to us in the 20th and 21st century. They're kind of like our human trails to get where we need to go. And we kind of just expect that other animals should just stay off them because they're for us. But all these roads and highways really are ecologically extreme in their impact on wildlife, right? Like maybe you could briefly share some overall statistics or descriptions that help summarize how much our road network has radically altered animal lives and habitats.
Yeah, it's really quite profound. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Carrie, when you mentioned that, roads are kind of these logistical essentials in
Yeah,
our
we don't
lives,
think
right?
much
We don't think
about
about
them.
them. Yeah, we just use them every single day and, we don't really notice them. And when we do think about them, we think about them as these sort of forms of human connectivity, right? They're our trails. They're how we get to grocery stores and hospitals and schools and fishing holes and all the fun things we like to do, right? And so, we have these kind of fundamentally positive associations with roads as these instruments of mobility and connectivity and freedom, right? And, I think that the kind of the ironic thing about that is that they do exactly the opposite for basically all other forms of life, right? They curtail and prevent animal mobility and freedom. And obviously the primary way they do that, right, is roadkill, by killing animals directly as they try to move around the landscape. And I mean it's yeah, it's almost hard to fathom how much roadkill occurs on American roads. There are some estimates that there are more than 1 million vertebrate animals. So that's just, not even including the insects and the arachnids, right?
Oh,
Just the mammals and the birds and the lizards and the snakes and the frogs, the vertebrate animals, more than 1 million vertebrates being killed on American roads every single day, right? So there's
every
literally
day.
every day, yeah. So there's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive. And I think that's, again, I mean, it's something that because we do it so constantly, we don't really think about it. And, I think that historically there were lots of conservation groups who focused on other problems like poaching and
Hunting,
deforestation
right?
and
Like, yeah.
hunting, right? Dams, and obviously all of those are sort of worthy ecological issues to deal with. But, roads dwarf them all in a lot of ways as kind of this killer of wild animals. And in some ways, roadkill is just the tip of the iceberg, right? You also have this kind of barrier effect that roads create. This moving fence of traffic on so many of our major interstates and federal highways that prevent animals from completing their migration. And there are examples of huge numbers of animals like elk and deer and antelope starving because they can't get to that good habitat on the other side of a big highway. We've got road salt is a big problem. We're spreading huge amounts of salt on our highways, and that's running off into rivers and lakes and, turning fresh water increasingly saline. We've got road noise pollution, which is this big form of habitat loss for so many species. We've got tire particles, running off into the environment and killing fish. So there are all of these different problems for nature that roads create. And what I'm trying to do in this book is attempt to account for as many of those different ecological issues as possible.
Yeah, and I think you do accomplish that. When and animal species, I learned in your book, don't all just respond to roads in the same way. Like um they don't just kind of say it's pretty complicated. They don't just go, "Oh, I'm going to find a safe time to cross or something." Different animals respond differently to our roads and the mechanized vehicles. And the scientists in your book have talked about four different ways that animal species deal with roads in terms of more skittish responses to more cavalier crossers or more cautious crossers. Can you tell us about those four types of crossers and like maybe what species tend to fall into which category?
Yeah, definitely. So this was a scientist named Sandra Jacobson, and some of her colleagues kind of classified animals into those four different categories you're mentioning. And the first is what they called the non-responders, and those are basically animals who don't really notice or think about traffic. And you can think about, frogs and toads and snakes, a lot of the reptiles and amphibians, right? These aren't necessarily the most brilliant animals in the world, and they're just kind of
They're just
crossing the
going.
road. They're just
They're not
going, right?
looking. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not looking. They don't really know what a car is, right? So especially those amphibians, those frogs and toads and salamanders, they're completing these migrations of their own. They're walking down to their breeding ponds on warm, wet spring nights, looking to mate. And, often roads are in the way, and they just wander across the road, no matter what the traffic is, and lots of them get hit as a result of that, right? As you can imagine, there are lots of horrifying accounts of thousands of frogs or salamanders being killed in a single evening. So that's the kind of the non-responders, right? The animals who don't really pay much heed to traffic. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the avoiders, animals who really just steer clear of roads, even at very low traffic volumes. So kind of the classic avoider is the grizzly bear, this big, really smart, wary, large, apex predator who understands that humans are dangerous, and cars are a threat, and they're really trying to steer clear of people whenever possible. And so they're not crossing highways hardly at all. Because again, they're just avoiding that traffic, and they don't get hit by cars that often as a result. But they're really subject to this habitat fragmentation, right? Because if you're not crossing the highway at all, well, maybe your potential mate is on the other side of the highway, or maybe you need to cross the highway to find, a big unoccupied territory where you can live, right? So they're really vulnerable to this habitat fragmentation issue, right? So I think that's fascinating to consider, is that you have these two polar opposite problems or responses to the road, just walking across the
Yeah.
highway, no matter the traffic, and then avoiding the highway altogether. And they're affecting animals in very different ways, but they're still a big problem. And then in the middle, you've got two other categories. You've got the pausers. Those are animals like skunks or porcupines, who kind of wander out there and onto the highway, and they stop, which is never great. And that's in part because they have these evolutionary defense mechanisms, right? That they kind of stand their ground. Think about a skunk spraying its potential predator. Well, that works really well against, coyotes and wolves and mountain lions and other, natural predators. But, when your predator is an F-150 barreling down the
Oh,
highway, the worst possible thing you can do is pause and stand your ground. And then the other category that I think is worth mentioning are the speeders. And these are animals like deer or like humans who kind of wait for gaps in traffic, and then they dart across the road. And that's why, it seems like deer sometimes jump into your car, in front of your car, and get hit, because they're waiting for that gap in traffic and then darting across the highway. But they don't always judge the gap very well, and sometimes they try to run through a gap that closes too rapidly. So you've got all of these different behaviors and different responses, and roads are a problem for all of those critters in different ways.
if you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman, talking with award-winning conservation journalist Ben Goldfarb about his fascinating new book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. His website has more information at bengoldfarb.com. Ben, in your book, we learn a lot about the importance of animal migrations for them to breed and to feed on certain foods in certain places, certain seasons. So some states, especially in the West, are starting to build more overpasses and underpasses, as we talked about, in key spots that funnel animals to them with some fencing. Um, Overpasses and underpasses must be designed for specific species to cross safely where they either won't cross the highway, so it fragments their habitat, like the bears we were talking about, or where they do cross and they're getting killed by the hundreds. And so I thought just for a brief overview of an overpass and an underpass, we could start by talking about the overpass that's going to be, I guess, the largest wildlife overpass, which is out in LA because of the mountain lions who are getting inbreeding happening because they can't deal with, and I don't think anyone really can deal with the LA traffic. And so I thought we could talk about that briefly as a overpass. And then for an underpass, maybe you could tell us about that turtle underpass that was put in the deadliest spot for reptiles in Florida, which is south of Orlando, where a road split Lake Jackson in half.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start with that LA overpass for mountain
Yeah.
lions that you mentioned, because it's probably the most famous wildlife crossing in the US and possibly the world right now, and it's under construction as we speak. So the story there is basically there's this little population of mountain lions who live in the Santa Monica Mountains west of Los Angeles. And LA is one of the only mega cities in the world that has large cats inside its city limits, right? So these are really kind of urban mountain lions who have done an amazing job making a living in and around people. But the problem is, they live on this little island of habitat, right? Surrounded by this ocean of freeways. They've got the 101 and the 405, some of the busiest highways on earth, hundreds of thousands of cars every single day going along these
That's the
these
moving
major
fence you were
roadways.
talking about.
It's
Like
yeah,
making
it's
it
it's
happen.
it's like the moving Berlin Wall. It's just this
Yeah.
totally impenetrable barrier to these cats. And so what's happened over time is that, as you mentioned, they've become very inbred, right? And the reason for that is that they can't really leave their little patch of habitat because of that moving fence of traffic. And no new mountain lions can enter the population from elsewhere in California. They can't, break through that moving fence. And so, these cats in the Santa Monica Mountains, they're stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great
That's
granddaughters.
gross.
It's really tragic. And, as a result, they've become very inbred over time. And now they're starting to suffer genetic defects. And, they've entered what scientists have called an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral that's going to wipe them out eventually if nothing is done. But fortunately, something is being done, and it's that wildlife overpass that you mentioned, this giant structure at a site called Liberty Canyon, where scientists have tracked mountain lions kind of approaching the highway. And it's this huge bridge, and even calling it a bridge is kind of a misnomer because it's really more like, some of the architects have put it, this giant piece of solid terrain that cars are going to pass through, because it's going to have trees and shrubs and rocks and logs and chaparral and all of the native vegetation. The idea is to create this kind of new ecosystem that spans the highway that will lead mountain lions and all kinds of other animals like bobcats and coyotes and deer back and forth, and ideally heal up or to stitch together that kind of ecological wound that the highway created. So that's an incredibly exciting project. As you say, it's going to be an enormous structure, and hopefully it'll be done by the end of 2025 or early 2026. And fingers crossed, the animals will start using it pretty quickly after that.
Yeah. And then underpasses, which are usually more affordable and more common, and a lot of times we don't
Right.
see them, the little culverts and different things that go under our roads. But they can be extremely effective for certain kinds of animals. And you mentioned an underpass that was out in Florida that one of the biologists there really worked hard on, because there were so many, I think it was turtles, but I can't remember if there were frogs and snakes too, but just constantly getting massacred in this one spot near Lake Jackson.
Yeah, exactly. And this was a highway that kind of was built, before NEPA or any other environmental laws, and it just cut right through the middle of this kind of lake wetland area. And because of that, turtles had to kind of cross the highway from one lake to another, after this highway turned a single lake into two lakes. And, in the early 2000s, this herpetologist, Matthew Oresco, down there in Florida, he documented this horrific turtle kill situation, whereas the turtles crossed the highway from one lake to another, they were just getting massacred. And obviously turtles, they're kind of the quintessential non-responder,
Yeah.
those animals we were talking about that are just moving across the highway no matter what. They're obviously very slow.
Yes.
That's the whole thing about turtles. And so they're very susceptible to to
Uh,
huge numbers of roadkill. And what he documented was this enormous problem. He spent a very long time, a couple of years, basically moving turtles back and forth across this highway in like those big Rubbermaid tubs. Kind of a crazy situation. Risking his own life and safety. Going
right.
through traffic carrying these turtles, but that was never going to be sustainable. And so finally what he managed to successfully push for was this sort of eco passage, basically these underpasses connected by a concrete wall, essentially. So the turtles, they bump into that wall as they're approaching the highway, and then they follow the wall to one of these culverts, one of these tunnels that leads under the highway, and then they can walk through that culvert, that tunnel, to get from one lake to another. So, I think that's just a cool
Yeah.
project in a couple of ways. I mean, it's been incredibly effective. It's basically ended that huge turtle kill
Fantastic.
crisis. But it's also a cool illustration, I think, that a lot of these southeastern states can build these passages as well. I think that historically it was those western states like Colorado, where I live, or Utah, Wyoming, California, who did a lot of this work. But increasingly states like Florida and North Carolina and Tennessee and hopefully Georgia
I know
soon
we need to get
uh,
Georgia in there. Yes.
will be doing this work as well. So it's really becoming this kind of national and even international movement.
And another thing I wanted to have you briefly mention, you touched on this before, but I hadn't thought as much about the aspect of highway noise from our vehicles and how that audio aspect was so disturbing to animals, as many of them experience sound more profoundly than we humans do. Can you tell us a little bit about how traffic noise affects other animals' lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the first thing to remember about traffic noise is that it's really, I mean, it really is a huge public health crisis as well as an ecological crisis, right? There's lots of scientific literature showing that road noise pollution is really bad for us humans.
Right. We don't like it
It's
either.
no, we don't. Yeah, there, lots of studies showing that it elevates our cortisol levels and our blood pressures and our risk of stroke and cardiac disease and all kinds of other maladies. So, it's really one of the great public health crises of our time. I think it's taking, millions of years collectively off of our lives here in the US and beyond. And it's as you alluded to, it's equally a problem for wild animals as well, right? Imagine being an owl, for example. Owls have, of course, incredibly sensitive hearing, and they can hear sounds that we humans certainly can't. And they're constantly listening for the crunch of a rodent's footsteps in the leaf litter, right, to swoop down and grab it. But if you can't hear the crunch of those mouse's footsteps because of the din of engines and tires, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? You can't survive. And so road noise pollution is this huge form of habitat loss, that's just driving animals away from vast swaths of land. Or think about being a songbird, a male songbird who has to sing to attract a mate, right? And having your song totally drowned out
Now they're having to
by
scream.
traffic noise. They're having to scream, exactly. And there's lots of research showing that animals, have to adjust their vocalizations in the presence of roads. And in some ways, then those songs and calls become less effective. If you're a songbird who has to scream to attract a mate, well, that's not as attractive a song, right?
Right, or
So
maybe they can't hear you either,
or they can't
and
hear
so
you, exactly.
and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think
So
your book was talking also about, you mentioned stress for us, but that when they capture the scientists will capture small animals and they'll see that they just are not thriving when they even when they I think you had like some phantom sound things there, like even if they do an experiment where they just introduce the sound of a highway, the animals don't do as well like physiologically. And that was fascinating to me and upsetting.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that experiment, Kat, because I think it's such an interesting and telling one. So this is this project called the Phantom Road Experiment, basically, where these scientists recorded the noise of traffic and then they played that noise through speakers in a forest during songbird migration season. And what they found was that a lot of birds just avoided the area altogether. But as you say, the birds who stuck around were in kind of worse body condition. And the reason for that is that, if you're a little songbird, you have to listen constantly for the sound of predators, right? You're listening for that
Vigilant.
fox, you're vigilant, right? You're listening for the sound of a falcon's wings or the fox who's, creeping through the underbrush. But, if those sounds are drowned out by all of that road noise, you have to look for predators instead. You can't listen for them. And every second that you're looking around for a hawk or a coyote is a second that you're not eating insects or berries and all of the food that you need as a migrating songbird to, get to Mexico or wherever you're going. So, that kind of vigilance foraging trade-off, as the scientists put it, is a really big problem. We're just drowning out all of the acoustic cues that animals need to survive.
Yeah, that's pretty upsetting. But on maybe a more positive note, your crossing
Yeah.
talks about solutions throughout. And if I was going to summarize my own take on the solutions in road ecology for wildlife to begin to recover from our traffic system and vast network of roads dissecting their home territories, I would say try not to build any new roads, remove a portion of the existing roads and rewild them, restrict access to roads at certain times of day or certain seasons when animals are more likely to cross, retrofit existing roads with wildlife underpasses and overpasses, reduce the speed limit on many roads or redesign any new roads so people must naturally drive slower. And then I think in general, reduce the number of vehicles on the roads to avoid creating a moving fence or the need for additional roads to be built. So, what do you think of that summary? And if you want to kind of expand on something.
Yeah. Wow. That all sounds so radical when you lay out all of those those solutions one by one. And I'm sure that there are some listeners thinking, really, we're gonna restrict the number of vehicles using a road, in the United States of America? That sounds crazy. Um, but yeah, I think that's a fantastic list. I think that in some ways we can start with our national parks, right? And I know that's a subject that's near to your heart, is because you're writing a
Yeah.
book about national parks. But these are places that animals are theoretically safe from hunting and development and all of these other stressors, but they're not safe from cars, right? We have lots of cars in our national parks. They're sort of fundamentally places that were meant to road trip to, right?
Yeah.
They're windshield wildernesses, as some historians have called them. And look, I love driving to national parks too. But we know that roads are a huge problem in these parks. Both from a roadkill standpoint and from a road noise standpoint. And there are parks like Denali National Park in Alaska or Zion in Utah, who have taken really dramatic steps to restrict the amount of traffic there, by sort of prohibiting private vehicles in much of the park and forcing Americans to ride the bus. I know that sounds like a crazy
Yeah,
thing.
you have to be on a tour
Um,
bus in Denali to see it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a fantastic place to start, right? Is to
Yeah.
take these protected areas, these sanctuaries for wildlife, and say, okay, we're going to dramatically restrict the number of vehicles that access these places. Americans can still see them, right? You can just get on the bus and ride it with all your other fellow passengers. So I think that's a great place to start. You mentioned the idea of road removal and rewilding. I think that's a fantastic approach as well. We have just hundreds of thousands of miles of old, derelict logging roads in this country, including plenty in national forests around Georgia. The U.S.
Yeah.
Forest Service is the single largest road manager on Earth,
I was so
unbeknownst
surprised
to
to
most
hear
people.
that in your book
Yeah,
that most of the roads are actually in the our U.S. forest land.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking, and and I mean there are national forests out there that have higher road densities than New York City or Atlanta, which is just mind blowing. And those roads, they're not getting a whole lot of traffic, but they're also causing lots of environmental problems by they're sort of constantly bleeding silt and sediment into streams, and poachers access them, and all of the noise from ATVs chases animals away, right? So we can just dramatically reduce the amount of roads in our national forests and other forms of public land, and the Forest Service and other organizations is doing that right now, sort of chewing up these old road beds and replanting them and letting them return to nature. And I think that's a really fabulous way to kind of, increase the habitat security that so many of these species need, give them these large unroaded areas where they can thrive.
I like those ideas. Well, Ben, to wrap up, a lot of people listening may have personal vehicles that we drive, me included with my Honda Civic. What can listeners do to help redesign our human spaces or to give other animals more safe space to get where they need to go to survive and thrive?
Yeah, that's a really big and important question. It's a difficult one because it's really hard to change our behavior as drivers in a lot of ways, right? I mean, we live in this landscape that was created for cars, and we in some
Yeah,
cases we just have no choice but to drive, right? I do plenty of driving, and I always encourage people to drive less at night when possible, because that's a kind of an important movement period for a lot of species. But I also drive at night, right? I'm a hypocrite when it comes to this stuff in so many ways. And so I think if the goal is to urge Americans to drive less and drive slower, I mean, that's really not how we're going to solve the problem, right? It's just too hard to change driver behavior, I think, in most cases. So, I'd encourage listeners to become advocates for these wildlife passages that we're
yeah.
talking about. We have to change the physical infrastructure to make it safer for animals to move around the landscape. And one of the great things about these wildlife crossings is that they're really nonpartisan in a lot of ways. They're these structures that everybody can get behind. Nobody wants to hit a deer, right? And we know that these underpasses and fences and other infrastructural changes, they're really good for public safety as well as for wildlife, and those underpasses tend to pay for themselves really quickly,
Yeah.
because they just prevent a lot of these dangerous, expensive crashes. And so here in Colorado, where I live, 85% of the public supports building more of these wildlife crossings. And so politicians like them. And so I'd encourage people to become advocates for those structures, write your elected officials and say, hey, I'd noticed this huge deer collision hotspot near where I live. Can we get, the DOT to study that situation and think about solutions? It's really a kind of a problem we're going to solve by changing our infrastructure, not necessarily by changing our behavior as drivers.
Well, that's the end of our show. What I want to thank you, Ben Goldfarb, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program and telling us more about your book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. Thanks for your engaging stories and books that help us connect with the more than human animal world and to see things from wildlife's perspective.
Thanks for your wonderful questions, Carrie. I so appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining and tuning in to In Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. We post action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, facebook.com/In Tune to Nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species, such as by driving slowly and letting animals pass over roads to get where they need to go. Thank you for listening. Cheers.